Sutra. To those who've encountered suffering, weary of sickness, aging, death, they speak about nirvana, which brings all suffering to an end. So those possessed of blessings who've made offerings to past Buddhas and resolved to seek the superior Dharma, they speak of enlightening to conditions. To those who are the Buddha's sons, who cultivate various practices, seeking wisdom unsurpassed, they speak of the way of purity. Commentary. To those who've encountered suffering, although common people suffer, the more they suffer, the more they like it. And the more they suffer, the more suffering they encounter. Basically, affliction is the cause of the suffering we undergo, but people don't want to put their afflictions aside. They want to keep the communication link between themselves and their afflictions. They can't leave them. They can't separate from the causes of their suffering. The more they suffer, the more they must suffer. When their suffering reaches its extreme point, they fall into the hells where they suffer eternally, never obtaining happiness. That's the way it is with common people. Those of other religions wish to end suffering, but they are unable to find a path which will lead them out. They cultivate and uphold methods of their religions, but they are unable to end suffering. They continue to undergo suffering, and although it is not as intense as that in their house, they may still run off and become hungry ghosts if they are not careful. Those of outside ways cannot ultimately put an end to suffering. There are also people who are intelligent and clever and have a bit of worldly wisdom. They have a thorough understanding of mundane dharmas, but they do not understand transcendental dharmas. When they run into causes and conditions of suffering, they have no way to bring them to an end. Wishing to end suffering, they only succeed in running into more suffering. Do you know how they think? They think, perhaps I shall rob someone of his money and then I won't have to suffer. Because this kind of person has a small measure of intelligence. He knows how to treat people. He catches someone off guard and sneaks off with his wealth or takes it by force. In spite of the fact that he is wise, other people also have wisdom. He may think he can get away with his clever tricks, but eventually he sets off a burglar alarm. The police get the call and take him to jail. If the crime is minor, his time may not be long. For a heavy offense, he may be in for a long time. He thus receives his retribution in the world of people. What about the future? People like this cannot end suffering. Where do they go? In the future, they may become animals. There are various reasons for falling into the hells or becoming an animal or a hungry ghost. It's not just a matter of one kind of cause or condition. I'm simply mentioning some of them, but these are not the only ones. There are all manner of causes and conditions which can lead one to fall into the three evil paths and endure the suffering there. Weary of sickness, aging, death. Fundamentally, there are three sufferings: eight sufferings and all the limitless sufferings. The three sufferings are: 1. The suffering with the suffering. 2. The suffering of decay. 3. The suffering of process. The suffering within suffering refers to the suffering of poverty. The suffering of decay occurs when one's happiness starts to wear thin and one's wealth eventually runs out. It is simply happiness gone bad. The suffering of process refers to the life process itself. One grows from youth to middle age and then to old age. The constant change in every thought is like the action of the waves on the sea. When the first wave disappears, the next one takes its place, and yet another follows it. No one can avoid the suffering of the life process. The first of the eight sufferings is that of birth. But when I was born, I didn't even know what was happening. You say, how could that be considered suffering? You didn't know what was happening, it's just that you don't know that reveals the intensity of the suffering. It is a trauma you cannot even remember later on just because of the suffering of birth. You will be forced to endure the suffering of old age. What is the suffering of birth? When children are born, they cry as if to say, "This world is truly full of suffering, suffering, suffering." Although they suffer, later they forget. They get caught up in the flow of life and forget to look back. They start thinking, this world isn't so bad. In the beginning, they knew it was suffering, but after they are 3 years old, they forget their suffering. Forget what suffering. When a child is still in his mother's womb, he feels like he's inside a volcano. If she is something hot, if she is something cold, he feels like he's in the house of ice. But there's no way he can speak up an object to these problems. As he is born, he feels like he's being squeezed between two mountains. What is more, while in the womb, the child is never exposed to the air. And the moment the air hits his body, he feels as if he is being slashed with knives, and so he screams and cries. Having forgotten the suffering of birth, during his prime he doesn't feel particularly troubled. But once he gets old, his eyes refuse to help him, his ears refuse to work, and so do his teeth. He can't appreciate the taste of the food he eats. This is the second suffering, that of old age. Getting old in itself is not all that bad, but once old, he can't walk anymore and has to lean on a cane to get around. When he walks, his legs don't listen to his orders. He may think to take a step, but his legs are lazy and refuse to move. It takes a great deal of energy to walk a single step. Would you say that this was suffering or not? Not many years before, when he sent down another order, his six senses all obeyed promptly, but now they refuse to obey. But even that cannot be considered real suffering. If you have a bit of skill in being patient, you won't mind it so much. The suffering of sickness, however, is definitely frightening. Sickness is most democratic, from an emperor, president, king, or a great official to the lowest beggar. No matter who you are, if you get sick, you will feel you have lost your freedom. Forced to stay in a hospital and follow the doctor's orders, you feel that sickness is a terrible suffering. There are many kinds of diseases and many kinds of suffering to go along with them, but even these are not as extreme as the suffering of death. There is no suffering greater than that of death. Birth, old age, sickness, and death are all suffering, and birth and death are the extremes. The death and birth involve the same kind of suffering. Dharma masters of the past have said that birth is like ripping the shell from a live tortoise, and death is like skinning a live cow. Would you call this suffering or not? Why do we study the Buddha Dharma? Because we wish to end birth and death and escape from the revolving wheel. So, the text says, weary of sickness, aging, and death, the suffering of birth is included in these lines. Not only do we face the sufferings of aging, sickness, and death, but there is also the suffering of being separated from what one loves. You say, I really love that person. Maybe you are a man who loves a woman, or a woman who loves a man. You love each other and it makes you very happy, but when you have to part, you suffer. I can avoid that kind of suffering. You say, we will simply never part. Wherever she goes, I will follow. If the one I love runs to the ends of the heavens, I will follow her there. If she runs to the moon, I'll go to the moon. If she runs off to the sun, I'll follow her there. You will, when she dies, will you go along with her? Yes, you say, definitely. If you do, then you suffer. But if you don't, you suffer too. Either way, you have to suffer. It just doesn't work out. Then there is a suffering of being around what one hates. I just basically can't stand that person, you say. Perhaps it's even your own spouse. You may really be dissatisfied, but she follows you wherever you go. Or perhaps you say, I can't stand that friend of mine. I've got to get away from him. But when you move to another city, you make another friend who turns out to be exactly like the first. This is called the suffering of being around what you hate. Those with whom you have no affinity you grow to detest. But the way fate would have it, when you leave that person and go somewhere else, you run into someone exactly like him. The person you left behind was half a pound, and this person turns out to be 8 ounces, no more, no less, exactly the same. There is also suffering of not getting what one wants. You may want to get rich, but you're always poor. You may want to become an official, but you are always a clerk. You may want a good wife, but you can't find one. You may want a good husband, but you can't find one. You can't get what you want, and you brood on it morning and night, causing yourself endless affliction. Why? Because you can't get what you seek. Because you can't get it, you suffer even more, to the point that insomnia strikes. You toss and turn, you roll over on one side, but you can't get to sleep. You roll over on the other side, and you still can't get to sleep. From dusk till dawn, you don't sleep a wink. The next morning, your eyes hurt, your body is tired, and you feel listless. Would you say that was suffering or not? I don't suffer in that way. You say I'm not greedy to get rich, to become an official, or to find a good wife or husband. I don't want anything at all. I don't hate or love anyone, so I don't enjoy suffering, do I? Your body is still subject to the tricks played on it by the five skandhas: form, feeling, thought, activity, and consciousness. They rattle around in your body, hopping back and forth all day long, driving you to the point that you haven't even the time to take a breath. Form, feeling, thought, activity, and consciousness are the five skandhas, and no one can avoid the suffering of the raging blaze of the five skandhas. It is the most suffering of all. They speak about nirvana. Because of all these sufferings, the Buddhas teach the Dharma of nirvana. What is nirvana? Ni means not produced, vana means not destroyed. You must not be attached to the false shell of the body, the physical body. Don't be attached, but seek instead the supreme way and attain the happiness of nirvana, where there is no birth or death. Without birth and death, you will have ended the three sufferings, the eight sufferings, and all the limitless sufferings. You will have attained the four virtues of nirvana: permanence, joy, true self, and purity, which brings all suffering to an end. If you obtain nirvana, you will have exhausted the limits of suffering. To those possessed of blessings, people who have cultivated the way and made offerings to past Buddhas, and who have in the past made offerings to the triple jewel. If you would like to avoid suffering, then make offerings to the triple jewel. In the presence of the triple jewel, perform acts of merit and virtue. However, when you do, don't say, I gave money to the temple. What did they spend on it? You shouldn't ask. You shouldn't pay attention to how the offering is used. You plant your own blessings and don't worry about what is done with your offering. If you make offerings to the triple jewel, do everything within your power to seek blessings and wisdom before the triple jewel. How does one seek blessings? To foster merit and virtue is to cultivate blessings. How does one seek wisdom? Study the Buddha Dharma, listen to the Sutra lectures, and read and recite Sutras. The text says, to those possessed of blessings. Why do they have blessings? Because in the past they made offerings to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, resolved to seek the superior Dharma. That doesn't mean to go on to make progress to seek the superior Dharma. Superior means special, a special kind of Buddha Dharma. They speak of enlightening to conditions. The Buddhas teach them the Dharma of the 12 conditioned causes. 1. Ignorance, which conditions action, which conditions consciousness, which conditions name and form, which conditions the six sense organs, which conditions contact, which conditions feeling, which conditions craving, which conditions grasping, which conditions becoming, which conditions birth, which conditions old age and death. Those of the vehicle of the conditioned enlightened ones, one of the two vehicles, cultivate by means of the 12 conditioned causes. So those who are the Buddha's sons, who cultivate various practices, seeking wisdom unsurpassed, they speak of the way of purity. The way of purity is the 6 paramitas.